Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event with Cory Doctorow. A pleasure to have you here today with us. We're also joined by representatives from three tech unions here in the UK. We've got Gabrielle, who is a rep at Unite for Google. We've got Eleanor, who is at UTAW, rep for TikTok. And I'm Sarthak. I'm a rep at Deliveroo, and I'm part of Prospect, Union at Prospect. Cool. So the way this is going to work, Cory, if you could talk about your Esteem book for a while, and then we can ask some questions for a few, and then once that's done, we'll kind of go around, talk about some of the work that we've been doing in our unions as well, and we'll keep it as free-flowing as possible. So if people have questions, please put them in, and that's why I've got my laptop here. I'll try and filter them through.
You're not just answering your email.
No, I wish.
Those progress bars aren't going to watch themselves.
I've closed all my work tabs
Oh, very good.
specifically for this. Cool. So yeah, Cory, do you want to talk a little bit on?
Well, thank you very much. What an honor to be here. I'm also a member of a British union. I'm a member of the NUJ. And I have, for the last 25 years, worked for an American nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, as well as helping to found a British analog to it called the Open Rights Group. And when you work on tech policy, when you're trying to help people understand why it's important that their human rights make the transition from the physical world to the digital world, or increasingly these days that their human rights aren't confiscated in the physical world using digital tools, it's often a hard problem because you're trying to get people to care about things that are very abstract, very technical, and can seem very far away. And so to heighten the salience and the immediacy of these things, to get people to care about them before it's so bad that their house is on fire, you come up with a lot of parables and analogies. And I write science fiction stories, so sometimes you do some fiction, and sometimes you come up with a word. And so I came up with this dirty word, enshittification. It turns out that the minor license to profanity is a winning addition to tech policy analysis. People just love to swear. And so in addition to being a sweary word, I thought I would talk to you a little about what enshittification means in a more technical sense, at least according to my lights, and what that has to do with labor struggles. So enshittification is first a kind of diagnosis or an observation about how platforms go bad. And platforms really are the endemic form of enterprise online. Maybe a little surprising because when we started with internet fever in the late 1990s, so many of us were excited about disintermediation, not having middlemen. But I don't think we were angry about the idea of having people who provided services that helped other people get stuff done. We were angry about helpers becoming gatekeepers, about a publisher going from someone who helps a writer meet their audience to being someone who decides what can get published more broadly. And that happens when you have market concentration. Market concentration is across the board in every sector, whether you're thinking about vitamin C or intermodal freight or professional wrestling, or indeed the web, 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, we live in a world of highly concentrated markets. And how we got there is not a surprise or a secret. It's because we stopped enforcing competition law. Under Thatcher and her colleagues abroad, Ronald Reagan, Brian Mulroney in Canada, like all the best Americans, I'm Canadian, and Helmut Kohl and obviously Augusto Pinochet in Chile, we came up with this idea that monopolies are actually quite good. Because the only thing that really leads to monopoly is a company being just great. So if everyone is using Google search and it's got a 90% market share, you should assume that Google has just got the best search and not that they've done anything untoward. And wouldn't it be perverse to punish a company for being so great that we all decided to use their products? And so we end up with this official tolerance for monopolies that we're in about the 42nd, 43rd year of. And unsurprisingly, we've got monopolies. So when these intermediaries become monopolies, when they become oligopolists or cartels, they go from being helpers to being gatekeepers, and they start extracting data, money, bargaining power from workers and from the communities we serve. And so enshittification observes what happens when these platforms go bad. And it proposes that there's a kind of characteristic 3-stage progression of platform decay. That in the first stage, you have platforms that are good to their end users, but find a way to lock those end users in. And then once the end users are locked in and it's hard for them to leave, the platform puts the screws to them. It makes things worse for those end users in order to make things better for business customers. who then also pile into the platform. And those business customers, they can just be workers, right? An Uber driver is the business customer in the Uber platform. And once the workers pile in, they get locked in too. And, as workers, I think we understand that even if you've pieced together a living from 8 different employers, say, if one of them is like 30% of your income and overnight they tell you that they're not going to pay you anymore, well, that could be effectively 100% of your income. You might not be able to pay your mortgage. You might not be able to service your loans. If you're a small business, this is especially true. If you're a coffee shop that has an office building next door that's 20% of your receipts, and that building shuts down and the workers go home, you might not be able to run your coffee shop anymore. A 20% overnight drop in gross receipts might mean that you can't continue to service the loans on your espresso machines. You can't make payroll. You better hope your landlord will give you some rent relief, or you might not stay in business. So you have this lock into the business customers as well. And once the business customers are locked in, well, the platform harvests value from them too. It's not the case that if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. It's that the platform will take everything it can get. And if you're paying for the product and they can still treat you like the product, they will 100% treat you like the product. You may remember that on Apple's mobile operating system, iOS, they added a little tick box a few years ago. And if you ticked it, Facebook couldn't spy on you anymore. 96% of iOS users ticked the "don't let Facebook spy on me" button. I assume the other 4% were either drunk or Facebook employees or drunk Facebook employees, which makes a lot of sense because if I had to work for Mark Zuckerberg, I'd be drunk all the time. But as soon as Apple did that and decided to defend you from Facebook spying, they also turned on their own spying. Apple gathers the same data that Facebook used to gather from iOS users for the same reason, to run their ad targeting network. And when they were caught doing this by investigative journalists at Gizmodo, they lied about it. And now they admit it and they don't do anything about it. And so it doesn't matter whether you're paying for the product or not. The 1,000-pound distraction rectangle in your pocket was not an ad-supported giveaway. It's something you parted with your good hard-earned cash for, and they'll treat you like the product if they can. So in the final stage of enshittification, the platform has harvested all the value from users, except for whatever kind of mingy homeopathic residue they need to keep the users locked in and to keep the businesses locked to the users. And they gather the value in for themselves. And the executives and the shareholders divide it up however they see fit. But it should be said that this is a very brittle equilibrium. The difference between I hate Facebook and I can't seem to stop using it, and I hate Facebook and I'm never coming back, it's really razor thin. All it takes is one, live stream mass shooting or a whistleblower or a privacy scandal, and people bolt for the exits. Investors get cold feet. They think, well, maybe this company has reached the end of the road. There's mass sell-offs. The share price goes down. 2022, after the first quarterly results were announced for Facebook, and they were slightly lower on U.S. growth than anticipated, the market did a one-day $260 billion sell-off. It was the largest sell-off at that time in human history. You do love to see it. But when it happens, the executives panic, and being technical people, they have a technical term for panicking. They call it pivoting. And so it was that one day Mark Zuckerberg arose from his sarcophagus and said, "Hearken to me, brothers and sisters, for I've had a vision. I know that I told you that your future would consist entirely of arguing with your most racist uncle using the primitive text interface I developed in my dorm room to non-consensually rate the fuckability of Harvard undergraduates. But it turns out that the true future is for me to transform you and everyone you love into a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character to make it easy for me to imprison you in a virtual world I stole from a 25-year-old satirical dystopian cyberpunk novel that I call the Metaverse." And that's the final stage of enshittification, when the platform's a giant pile of shit. And the question is, why is it happening now? Because we didn't invent greed in the middle of the last decade. Platforms have always had the ability to change the rules from moment to moment because they're digital. They can just be updated from second to second. And my theory is that it used to be that bad things happened to tech bosses when they did bad things. They had to face competitors, but we shut down competition law. They had to face regulators, but when a sector dwindles to a half dozen companies, 3 companies, 2 companies, just one company, they capture the regulators. And, that may sound like a very abstract idea, but here's a very concrete way in which regulators get captured by firms. So the Competition and Markets Authority, they are based in Canary Wharf, but they're good eggs. They have done more work in the last 5 years to break up concentrated corporate power than we've seen in the UK in the last 50 years. That was going great guns until January. And then Keir Starmer fired Marcus Bokering, who'd presided over much of that work, and replaced him with a guy called Doug Gurr. And if that name is ringing any bells, it may be because you know him as the former head of Amazon UK, who is now in charge of regulating Amazon UK. That's what regulatory capture looks like. And it can get even worse. In Ireland, you have all the tech companies' headquarters. They all like to pretend to be Irish because that lets their funds float in a state of untaxable grace over the Irish Sea, because Ireland is a tax haven, which makes it a crime haven. It means that their data commissioner is the person who's ultimately in charge of deciding whether or not Facebook and the other tech companies that pretend to be Irish have violated your privacy rights. And so Ireland just replaced the data commissioner there, and they replaced him with a guy who used to work for Meta. And that may sound very bad, but it's actually worse than you think. So you may have read a book, and if you haven't, you should think about it. It's very good, called Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams, who was the first person that Facebook hired to do international government relations, to talk to political leaders around the world. She was this New Zealand diplomat. And she, over several years, became extremely disillusioned with Facebook and wrote a tell-all memoir called Careless People. And it turns out that, like all the other Facebook employees, when she signed up, she had to sign what's called a non-disparagement clause. And this non-disparagement clause makes it illegal for her to criticize Facebook. The arbitrator, because she also signed an arbitration clause, which means she doesn't even get to see a judge. She sees a man that Facebook pays to decide whether or not she has violated Facebook's contract. And that man has decided that she owes $50,000 every time she criticizes Facebook. They've calculated at this point she owes them $111 million for criticizing Facebook. And of course, it's probably higher than that because she's not allowed to criticize Facebook in private. And I think she might have said a few things about them, in the morning while drinking her coffee, but they don't know about those, so they can't fine her for those ones yet. And it's not just Sarah who signed the non-disparagement clause. It's the man running the data commissioner's office in Ireland who is legally not permitted to criticize Facebook, the company he's in charge of regulating. So that's regulatory capture. So we no longer see discipline from regulators. But there was another source of discipline that was really important. It was tech workers. Tech workers, although we're seeing some new unions popping up among tech workers, historically, the union density in tech work could not have been measured with an electron tunneling microscope. Basically didn't exist. But paradoxically, tech workers were super powerful. And they weren't powerful because they had solidarity. They were powerful because they were scarce and valuable. The American government agency, the National Bureau of Economic Research, estimated that the average tech worker in Silicon Valley was adding $1 million a year to their boss's bottom line. And this is why you've got the gourmet cafeteria and the free kombucha and the massages and a surgeon who'll freeze your eggs so you can work through your fertile years. Not because they like you. It's because they're worried that if you quit, $1 million will walk out the door. But if you get your power from scarcity, you don't consolidate it with solidarity. If you think that, you're a temporarily embarrassed founder and not a worker, that you're a peer of your boss because you both wear a hoodie, and he deigns to show up at the monthly engineering all-hands Zoom town hall, then when the supply catches up with the demand, you cease to be someone who gets to tell your boss to F off when they tell you to enshittify the product that you care about. Because I think a lot of tech workers care about their work. They care about their users. I don't know about you folks, but my path into tech was having my horizons expanded and my mind blown by the things that could happen with me when I went online. I discovered the words for who I was, the ideas that described how the world worked, the place that I should be, and the things that I should do. And it wouldn't have happened without the internet. I think there are a lot of people who find their way into tech that way and who just want everyone else to have that too. Sometimes to excess. We've all met the people who are very excited about telling you why you should install Linux. But also, a lot of us just want everyone else to have the benefits that we had. They're Tron-pilled. They want to fight for the user. And if you're working every hour that God sends for your boss and you're missing your mom's funeral to ship on time, and then your boss says, "Enshittify this," and there's someone across the street who'll give you a job that day, you can tell your boss to go to hell and not enshittify it. But when supply catches up with demand, well, then you have to confront the fact that tech bosses, when they're not afraid of their workers, treat them pretty badly. I mean, most tech workers don't write code. Most tech workers work in warehouses, or they deliver things, or they drive, or they do the other work, assembling iPhones. And those workers, they don't get treated well at all, right? If you make software for Apple, you get to have a pink mohawk and facial piercings. You wear a black t-shirt that says things your boss doesn't understand, but makes him feel a little uncomfortable. And they'll still give you, a stock option. But if you assemble iPhones for Apple, you work in a factory with a suicide net because it's not a nice place to work at all. If you write code for Amazon, you get treated pretty well. If you drive for Amazon, you piss in a bottle. And there is nothing about working in front of a keyboard that says that you can't have a suicide net in a pee bottle. And so I think that, and I'd be interested to hear what you folks think as organizers and as stewards, but I think that tech workers are starting to wake up and realize that they're not their boss's peers, and that when the boss can treat them badly, they will, and that they have an extraordinary imagination for how badly they can treat workers. That automation tools are an extremely powerful form of digital whip that can set quotas and enforce working conditions to a fine degree in a way that even the most intrusive control freak boss never dreamt of. That, automation tools are the things that can turn work from home into live at work, where you can have things that are looking at you out of your camera, measuring your keystrokes, plundering your hard drive, and making decisions about how you're going to get paid based on moment-to-moment activity. And that solidarity among all workers requires solidarity with tech workers and from tech workers, because it's our work that's destroying the workplaces of everyone else. And also, it's our ebbing power that we have to reclaim that really is allowing Enshittification to sweep all the platforms that we rely on. I don't know, I think that was about the time that you'd allotted to me. So I'd love to hear what you folks think.
We said 20 minutes and we are bang on 20 minutes. So that is
Good job.
really well done.
Whoa, there you go.
That was perfect.
And I broke my watch on day one of the tour, so I couldn't even look at my watch.
Fair enough. So yeah, really good timing. And the clock that's not even working. So
It's right twice a day, I'm reliably assured.
yes. So you said something there about kind of antitrust and monopoly power and stuff like that. I just want to explore that a little bit.
Yeah.
Because in the book, you go into a lot of detail around like the solutions of all this, like antitrust. There's actually a question here that's related to this. Most of these platforms are American, right?
Yeah.
And the American government is probably one of the worst cases of regulatory capture. And, very little antitrust enforcement really since the 1970s, 80s. I mean, maybe Lina Khan was an aberration, but that doesn't seem to have continued into the Trump administration, really. So realistically, and you did mention the CMA, right?
Yeah.
But what are the steps that can be taken by governments here in the UK, especially the EU, where they are prone to more regulation and stuff like that?
Yeah.
But like, what are the realistic steps that they can take, right? Because if all these platforms are American, then we are then subject to the whims and fancies of what they want.
Yeah. So it's a really complicated piece of geopolitics that's got a lot of moving parts, and they're changing day to day, because weirdly Donald Trump seems to be quite good for this, because all the countries that signed up to protect America's tech companies with the quid pro quo that they wouldn't have to pay tariffs are now finding that there's paying tariffs anyway. So, my friend Joey Davila says, when life gives you SARS, you make sarsaparilla. Like, we are really living through a moment where things are changing very quickly, and it's thanks to, Donald Trump's belligerent geopolitical incontinence. But, the story about why Europe is so muscular in its regulation is in part due to an outlook, but in part it's just due to nationalism. If the companies that were crushing the internet were called Olivetti, Deutsche Telekom, and Nokia, I don't think we would have the same enforcement as we do against Meta and Apple and Oracle or Google. And so there's just some kind of political economy there. And there's a joke from down east in Canada whose punchline is, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. Historically, the antitrust regime was built around the idea that you stop companies from becoming so big that you couldn't regulate them. And it's something that I think like libertarians should be able to get behind. If you think that the only role for government is enforcing contracts, they still have to be larger and more powerful than the parties whose contracts they're enforcing. Otherwise, they'll just be ignored. The referee has to be more powerful than the players in the field. So, the smallest government you can have is determined by the largest corporation you're willing to tolerate. So we are in something of a bind, it must be said. Now, you said that antitrust was dead in the US until Lina Khan, and that was an aberration. It's slightly more complicated than that. So antitrust actually kicked off under Trump 1. The cases against Facebook and Google started under Trump 1. But it wasn't that Trump was exceptional in some way. Trump was in many ways following a global trend, because we already had the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act underway in Europe. Well, we also had enforcement popping up in Germany, France, and Spain. Canada's antitrust enforcers had been remarkably weak through most of their history. Our Competition Bureau had only brought 3 merger challenges in the entire history of the agency and had never succeeded in challenging a merger. But in 2024, Justin Trudeau, our prime minister then, hardly known as a foe of concentrated corporate power, whipped his caucus to deliver the most wide-ranging enforcement powers with the Competition Bureau that I think any country in the world has. We saw antitrust enforcement kick off in Australia, Singapore, South Korea, and Japan. And, that is due to something that's happening kind of behind the scenes, a kind of political will, which is a very nebulous term, but you can see it when it's there. It's the tailwind that's blowing. And one of the reasons you know that this tailwind is really blowing is that it happened in China too. So, despite what Nick Clegg went around Europe saying for years when he was Meta's representative, China does not use its tech companies as an arm of soft power around the world. It views them as a competitor, both domestically and internationally, which is why they're cracking down on those tech companies. So something is blowing behind us. We have this tailwind, and it's not going to be easy. The best thing to have done would have prevented the transformation of tech into this oligopoly that makes it so hard to enforce against them. But this is not the first time this happened. There's this joke, before you have a law, you have to have a crime. Lenny Bruce has a whole bit about how the first law against having sex with a chicken arose. And so you always have to have something that people are doing before you pass a law against it. And, the way that we got competition law, antitrust law, was that we had horrific monopolies, right? Particularly the Standard Oil monopoly of John D. Rockefeller. And we figured out how to smash this monopoly. It took a long time. The Sherman Act, which was the first antitrust law, was passed in 1890. We broke up Standard Oil in 1912. So it's a long journey. It didn't happen overnight. And it happened because of all kinds of action. It happened coterminally with the rise of labor power, because one of the things that monopolies do is abuse their workers. And so workers have a common enemy with trustbusters when it comes to monopolies. It happened thanks to muckrakers. There's a woman, Ida Tarbell, who was the first woman in America to get a science degree. She was an ardent suffragist, but what she was most of all was a John D. Rockefeller hater. Her father had been a Pennsylvania oilman who was destroyed by the Rockefeller empire, and she devoted her life to investigating and writing about how the Rockefeller empire worked in a serialized set of 2 books, imaginatively called The History of the Standard Oil Company, Volumes 1 and 2, that were serialized in Collier's magazine, which was the biggest magazine in the country at the time. And when she explained to people how John D. Rockefeller had got his power, the people rose up, and it created the political will there. So there are many things we're going to have to do. But the good news is that the people who did this were not smarter or better than us. And they didn't know things that we don't know how to do. No one is asking people who are angry about corporate power to recover the lost arts of a stolen civilization. This is not like figuring out how to build a pyramid without power tools or embalm a pharaoh, right? This is just doing the hard yards of organizing, holding politicians to account, building power electorally and through unions, and creating electoral and union combinations that can make sure that we're exerting discipline in our politicians. This is about understanding that whether you're coming at this as a consumer or as a student or as a healthcare worker, that you have the same common enemy, in the same way that people discovered in the 70s that even though they all cared about different things, that they were all caring about ecology, that somehow there was something about endangered owls and the ozone layer that were really the same thing, even though it's not obvious that the gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere and the destiny of a charismatic avian are connected. Ecology turns them into a movement. We're going to have to build the movement, and it's not going to be easy. But, the good news is that if we figure it out, we don't just end up with better technology. We end up with the movement that we're going to need to resist genocide, fight rising fascism, and survive the climate emergency too.
Speaking of movements,
Yeah.
love that segue. We've got 3 tech unions here.
Yes.
So I'm going to hand this over to Eleanor to speak a little bit about the work that she's been doing at UTAW, and then we'll over to Gabrielle, and then finally me. Take it away.
So I'm Eleanor from UTAW. We are a branch of the Communication Workers Union. So UTAW stands for United Tech and Allied Workers. And the Communications Workers Union is probably more commonly known for like posties and telecoms workers. But we're the tech branch, we're national. I think it comes to a lot of what you've written about in your book and what you just said. We do a lot of work that goes across like kind of international stuff. So we focus a lot on no tech for apartheid. because obviously for us that's like an industrial issue. Like a lot of our employers are contributing to a genocide, and we also think a lot about like cobalt mining, etc., in the DRC and places like that. Those are kind of our international things that we do. And then in the UK, we organise most tech workers, just like you mentioned before, right? Most tech workers aren't just coders. I used to work for TikTok. I'm also not a coder. I'm a non-traditional tech worker in that I worked for a tech company but didn't do tech stuff. And then like I just said, I used to work for TikTok. So something that we've been doing a lot recently is supporting the TikTok workers there through a huge case of enshittification, which is where they're getting rid of all the human trust and safety workers. So all the people that are like the front line between you and very harmful, dangerous content are all being laid off currently. Or that most of them have actually been laid off. So we're fighting back against that. We're fighting back against the offshoring that they're doing, where they're saying they're replacing with AI, but actually they are offshoring to places like Kenya, Portugal, Turkey, where there's like basically no employer rights. They can pay them essentially pennies. Not that they were getting paid that well in the UK either. That's kind of how they're treating this like very crucial piece of work. So that's UTAW.
Awesome. It's funny about this offshoring or AI being just offshoring. I'm on a mailing list that's been around since the 90s for geeks, mostly in Bangalore, but across India. And the two jokes are that AI stands for absent Indians and ChatGPT stands for Gujarati people typing.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. Like AI isn't good enough in lots of ways. Like, will never be good enough to do moderation work. So what it is going to be is, like people in Kenya who live in company towns where they're surveilled like 24/7. Yeah.
Nice. Gabriel, do you want to talk a little bit about the work you're doing at Unite?
Of course. So I've been at Google for about 8 or 9 years, and I've been one of the Unite reps in Google for about 5 years. I came out of some of the sort of more officially sanctioned sort of employee organizing that used to exist in Google, where people were organizing around like personal like traits, like the Asian Googler network or LGBT Googlers and stuff like that. Yeah, so I've been doing labor organizing in Google for a long time. It really kicked up a gear back in 2023 when Google did a big round of layoffs worldwide. But they laid off about 6 to 7. I think the goal was about 6 to 7% of people worldwide, and we saw something approximate to that in the UK. And because of that, we saw a big uptick in people who were starting to think more in terms of labor organizing than as individuals. Because I think previously people were thinking of themselves as sort of rock star artists, no matter what they were doing. And I understand that. I work with a lot of fantastic colleagues, whether they're in marketing, whether they're in HR, whether they're in engineering. But I think people started to realize that ultimately Google does considering them to be numbers in a spreadsheet. And that made a big change in terms of the way that people were starting to think about that. And we've made a lot of progress in terms of organizing in that internally since then. Less in terms of sort of like the issue organizing that our colleagues at UTAW have been spearheading, but more in terms of the sort of the day-to-day organizing. We're had a lot of particular success in terms of working with some of the non-engineering functions in terms of building up strength of people who are seeking solidarity there. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that later.
My favorite, by which I mean the most disgusting thing about that 12,000 person layoff, is that it came 4 months before an $80 billion stock buyback that would have paid those workers wages for 27 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, talking about my experience at Deliveroo is like, I think 2023 was probably the year a lot of companies were doing layoffs, and so Deliveroo just did one, just because. And I think they laid off, 9% of the workforce, which is basically, you're talking about a couple of hundred people. At the same time, they did a £75 million buyback. So it was, very, very much a story across all unions. And I think 2023 was one of the years where, we saw a massive growth in our membership. I'm pretty sure you would have seen in yours. And frankly, that's when I joined the union. It was 2023. And when the facade of, like you said, tech workers being treated like superstars, I think that's when that contract fundamentally broke. I think when 2023, we probably had less than 2,000 members in our branch, and we're now at 3,000. like the rise has been kind of meteoric, and I'm pretty sure it's the case across tech unions in the UK, but especially I think in our branch we've seen a rapid rise, and companies that we wouldn't think of having members in, like AWS, Meta, Microsoft, and Nokia, like you were mentioning, and we're actually looking at recognition in Skyscanner now. So like these are companies that you wouldn't think would be. I kind of to what you're saying about like, oh, things change. There's a tailwind, and things change very quickly. We would not think of having the recognition agreement in Skyscanner, but that's something that could be possible in the very near future. So just maybe to highlight some of the work, because it'd be remiss of me not to do this. Just to highlight some of the work we've been doing in Prospect. A lot of our workers, and I'm pretty sure that'll be the case in your branches as well, are skilled workers. Actually, I'm a skilled worker. I haven't got my passport just yet. But yeah, one of the things that we did is actually gave evidence to the Migration Advisory Committee that was set up by this government, and kind of highlighted the kind of working conditions and like.
So this is the highly skilled migrant program.
Yes.
All right. That's how I came into the country too.
Sorry, that's my phone going. But we sat down with like DSIT as well, so the Department of Science, Innovation, and Technology, kind of talking about skills and how to do it. And it was, I think, what came out of it was like the government's got a lot of work to do on like actually understanding these things. I think a bit like you were saying, regulators probably a little bit asleep at the wheel. Definitely felt that. There's a lot of upskilling that regulators need to do to actually keep up and actually be able to regulate and do their jobs in a meaningful way. So kind of what I'm saying is, as a branch, what we found, and I'm pretty sure it's the same across all the branches, like there's definitely a redundancy culture just because there is a tech bro culture, and that kind of comes partly from the redundancies. If you see the figures in the redundancies, they tend to be disproportionately gender biased. And part of, I think, what we're doing is just kind of going, this has never been a better time to join a tech union. Never been a better time. The employment rights bill is coming out next year. Whatever you think of this government, that is a step forward. There's a lot in that bill to be excited about, I think. And I think this is the time to do it. And it's not enough to just be, like people were mentioning, it's not enough to just be a tech worker or coder. I think the solidarity has to be from collective perspective, not just from I can just join whatever company I want, so I'm not going to bother, because I think those days are starting to end.
It's remarkable how much solidarity our bosses have. So, Apple and Google have this arrangement where the largest check that Apple gets every year was written by Google. It's a $20 billion bribe not to enter the search market. That's incredible solidarity. Facebook and Google had an illegal conspiracy to rig the ad market called Jedi Blue, where they paid publishers less and they charged advertisers more. It's incredible solidarity. Lyft and Uber may be at each other's throats, but in California, when we had a ballot initiative to formalize worker misclassification, Proposition 22, they clubbed together and spent $225 million getting that passed and formalizing worker misclassification. They are not enemies. They really aren't.
Yeah. And speaking of enemies, because I think there's a very good question here about offshoring coming through. How do you create that kind of international solidarity? Because one of the things that I've seen is very much like, offshoring creating resentment, right? And so, we've seen it at Deliveroo, we've seen it at other companies as well, is once you do that, you would think the blame should go top, but it generally tends not to. And I think that that's a very crucial point if you want to build national solidarity. So, like, any thoughts on that?
Only that it's essential, right? That I don't know as much about the 19th century history of trade unions in America, but 19th century, or in the UK rather, but the 19th century history of trade unions in America is the history of waves of migrant strikebreakers, right? So if the Germans are striking, you hire Polish scabs. When the Poles unionize, you hire Italian scabs. And the unions did not consolidate until they became transethnic. And, the last, shamefully, and obviously given Americans' history, the last integration was black workers. But it took a long time for the American umbrella organizations to support the Pullman strikers, which was the largest black union. And in the meantime, the Pinkertons were able to hire black scabs and thugs because they were being excluded from the unions. And so it's only when you have that solidarity that you can make it work. This is a problem that it's not unique to tech, right? It's been underway for a long time. I remember just the incredible disappointment I felt in Canada when NAFTA came along, which was our free trade agreement with US and Mexico. And the auto companies started to send jobs to Mexico. And you would see CAW members, Canadian Auto Worker members, with the CAW bumper sticker and then some horribly racist sticker about Mexicans. It's like, no Mexican took your job. Your job was sent away by your boss. And I talked to friends, my dad's in the labor movement, and I talked to friends who are involved in this, and they said, what do you expect us to do? And I said, I don't know, to organize the factories in Mexico. And they said, well, that sounds very hard. It's across a border and I don't speak the language. And I'm like, well, it's like they used to mow you down with machine guns. This feels like a smaller lift than that. But then, during the first outsourcing rush to India, when I was living in Silicon Valley, there were workers who were repeating this almost word for word, except they didn't even have the excuse. Because like, well, the workers, who you would like to organize, they speak English. And you don't have to go to the country. You just use the internet to talk to them. And guess what? You're better at the internet than your boss is.
I want to jump in on that a little bit because something that we're doing at UTAW at the moment, which is connected to the TikTok thing, is trying to, like you've said, bring together as many different people from different places. So like Kenya, Istanbul, anywhere basically where there are moderators working on any platform, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, whatever. Because what, for example, in this case, TikTok are doing is they're moving to non-unionized places. So if we can unionize every place, TikTok won't have anywhere to, not just TikTok, any company, they won't have anywhere to go.
Yeah.
So that's why it's like, extremely key to like find your colleagues, your co-workers in other countries that aren't yet unionized, or when they are unionized, shout about them here, where we can amplify their story.
And there is one way in which I think you can build international solidarity, which is to the extent that people are subjected to what's sometimes called bossware, the technology that does workplace monitoring. It tends to be the same software everywhere. And so the same tools that can reclaim worker power work for all workers. So there's a computer scientist, she's a Googler, called Rita Kadri, who did a bunch of research on these things called Tuyul apps, Tuyul. It's an Indonesian word that means little demon. And it was developed by Indonesian gig riders. So, riding around on motorbikes as both taxis and delivery vehicles. And they clubbed together to build these little clubhouses up the side of the road where you could stop and use the toilet and fix your bike and have a cup of tea. But they realized that they had common technological problems and that they could hire programmers to jailbreak the apps and mod them. So the first one of these was very unambitious. It relates to the fact that graphic designers are 20-year-old sadists who think that 80% gray on white type is acceptable. And you had riders like me whose eyes were failing them, who were trying to navigate traffic but couldn't read their phones. So it's just a thing to upsize the font, like change the CSS and the whatever the little JSON object or whatever it was. But then they were like, oh, well, there's lots of stuff we can do with this. So you couldn't book a pickup for a train station when the commuter train came in unless you were directly in front of it in the killing field that was the 10 million vehicles in front of the train station when the commuter train came in. So they wrote GPS spoofing software so they could sit around the corner and spoof the GPS to the front of the train. But of course, one of the things that these apps do is something called algorithmic wage discrimination, which is where you use information both from platform and off platform about workers to estimate the lowest wage they'll take. And one of the things you do is a lot of A/B splitting where you offer them a slightly lower wage and see if they take it. And the wage offers, they aren't straightforward, right? It's like, well, you've got a certain distance and you got a certain amount of estimated time and maybe some complexity. And trying to like look at that number, right? Where it's like a €3 or a £3 ride and trying to figure out, am I getting paid less for this one or not? When you've got like 18 seconds and you're also about to be killed by someone in a lorry is very hard. And so you could just write apps that everyone can run that instantaneously calculates the wage and refuses all lowball offers. So you get across the board algorithmic wage raising. So these tools, they could be a common set of tools that were maintained by workers everywhere that worked against these apps everywhere.
Speaking on that, because there's a question that's come in about how we escape enshittification or enshittified platforms, right? Because that's a difficult thing. One of the reasons these enshittified platforms are so hard to break off because everybody's on them. So, is there value in investing kind of collective effort in trying to move off them through like open source alternatives or free alternatives, or is that just too hard? Is that too difficult for us to do because so many people are on the exact same platform? That's what drives some of its value.
So it's interesting because in a state of grace, right? These pocket distraction rectangles and laptops and implants and smart speakers, they're all the same thing. They're a Turing complete universal von Neumann machine. They can run every program, which means that for every 10-foot pile of shit in something you use, there's an 11-foot ladder you can build out of code that goes over it. Are you checking to see whether I'm using generic ink? I'm going to disable that check. Are you renting me the accelerator in my car? I'm going to disable that subscription feature. Are you spying on me with an app? I'm just going to block data transmission, right? Or block the port or block the data gathering. The problem is that for the last 25 years, every country in the world has been pressurized into passing what's called an anti-circumvention law. And this is a law that constitutes a blanket prohibition on modifying code that has been designed to resist modification. So if there's any kind of TPM, any kind of access control, anything that stops you from just using an API to alter the function, the way you would with a browser, then it becomes illegal to do so, to do that reverse engineering work and do that modification work. Even though that is how all the companies that we currently think of as the most respectable tech companies got there. When Apple was being crushed by Microsoft because the Office for the Mac was the most cursed piece of software ever made, and you just have to wave the install floppy around the office and all the files would go corrupt. They didn't just like beg Bill Gates to fix it. They reversed the file formats in Office and they made pages, numbers, and Keynote that could perfectly read Office file formats. But you do that to like the iOS runtime today, and they will nuke you until you glow because they have anti-circumvention law on their side. When Facebook was trying to tempt users off MySpace, it didn't just rely on like being a better service. It gave them a scraper. You gave the bot your login and your password. It would take those credentials and present them to MySpace. It would grab everything waiting for you and it'd stick them in your Facebook feed and you could reply to it and push it out. So you didn't have to worry about this network effect thing where everyone's on MySpace, but you want to use Facebook. You just go to Facebook, but you talk to the people on MySpace. And if Rupert Murdoch doesn't like it, he can pound sand, right? So this was an incredible tool. It was, as they say in Star Wars, a more elegant weapon from a civilized age, right? And we were just lobotomized and made to forget that this exists because it was made illegal everywhere. And it was made illegal because the U.S. trade representative, the person who's in charge of normalizing trade arrangements with everyone, said to every country in the world, if you don't want tariffs on your goods, you've got to pass these anti-circumvention laws. So this is an incredible opportunity right now because people are starting to wake up and realize not only is this keeping our tech sector in chains, there's a lot of money to be made in reversing and modding stuff, right? If you want to turn a check engine light into a diagnosis, you have to pay each manufacturer 10 grand a year, right? Well, like someone could just buy all the cars, get all the over-the-air updates, reverse them as soon as they pop, and then offer a subscription tool for every mechanic in the world for £20 a month that would like let you fix any car. That is a gigantic goddamn business that we've just decided not to get into because otherwise we'd have tariffs on our goods when we ship them to America, which we now have. And meanwhile, Trump is like telling Microsoft to shut off the International Criminal Court's Outlook access if they swear out an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu. So governments all over the world are saying, well, we better find a way to get off of these platforms. The problem they're going to have is even if you stand up fully feature compatible alternatives to Office 365 or G Suite or any of the other platforms, no one's going to individually manually copy and paste 1 million documents out of their ministry's repo and into the Eurostack. You need to like virtualize a phone and iterate through the records. You need to scrape. You need to have bots. You need to have alt clients. You need to have on-device bridging, all of which is illegal. So what we need to do is repeal this law. And then, we'll build the open source platforms. But just building the open source platforms is like building glorious housing in West Berlin for people who live in East Berlin, right? No one's going to move into it until you knock down the wall.
Thinking about that, so I remember earlier you were talking about how the monopoly law didn't ever really change in the US until people started paying attention to what was going on and they understood it and they paid more attention and they cared.
Yeah.
One of the things that I see as a bit of a challenge in terms of that today, so if you think about, for example, using a lot of these platforms, a lot of these social medias, a lot of the anger or upset around people who are using these platforms are like, I said this really hateful thing and I got banned.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot of people who the thing that they actually want is sort of not really aligned with the thing that they want to do is to be, you're talking about sort of, we're wanting to do this in a way that does not enable fascism more.
Right.
But the people who are actually a lot of people who are enthusiastic about that are people who are wanting to use it to enable fascism.
Sure.
So how do we build solidarity in a movement and take people who the thing they are upset about is they can't use it to be hateful and channel that into a way that improves it for everyone?
Well, let me answer that, take a step back and answer it. So if you want to make a policy, like if you want to make a law, it has to be administrable, right? There has to be some way, like think about poor Sarah Wynne Williams being prohibited from saying mean things about Facebook in her house, right? Obviously, that's not a thing Facebook can punish her for, so it doesn't really matter what they say. You make a law that says, pi is equal to 3. It doesn't matter, right? So you need to have administrable policies. And one of the problems with hateful speech rules, it's not that there isn't hate speech. It's not that the hate speech isn't important. It's not that it's not disproportionately felt by people in disfavored minorities. It's that adjudicating hate speech and administering a hate speech rule is really hard. You have to agree a definition of hate speech. You have to agree whether a specific instance rises to the definition. You have to investigate whether the firm took reasonable steps to prevent that hate speech. And then 7 years later, you can address one case of a thing that happens 100 times a minute. So I think it's better to ask, why are people on platforms where they are showered with abuse and harassed and made their lives terrible? And it's because the only thing worse than being a member of a disfavored minority who's continuously showered with abuse and your life is made terrible is being all of that and then being isolated from your community and being all on your own. So people stay, right? That, in fact, one way to think about this is that the cost that platforms can impose on their most disfavored users is determined in part by the likelihood that those users will leave. And so you can think of not moderating as a cost that you shift to your users, because you either pay moderators or you have people experience unmoderated harassment. And it's just literally how many pounds are going to be in your pocket at the end of the day versus how much misery your user is going to experience. Well, if we were to, for example, mandate APIs that allowed users to leave the platform, but still see the things that people wanted to say to them, and or if we were to legalize scraping, alt clients, on-device bridging, and those other tactics that have historically been used to allow people who've left one platform to see the things that were posted there, then on the one hand, you might discipline the firms, right? The people who run these companies might say, well, it's so much easier for my users to leave now. They're not balancing, do I give up my community or do I endure this abuse? Now they can keep the community and walk away from the abuse and go somewhere else off platform. Maybe I'll treat them better. Maybe I'll invest in better moderation. But if it doesn't, or if you're waiting for a regulator to figure out whether the firm violated the rules, because I'm not saying we shouldn't have rules about content moderation, but it's going to take a while to moderate it. You don't have to just sit there and take it until such time as the platform comes around. So I think that, I am, in politician style, answering the question I wish you'd ask, which is, what do we do about the people who are victimized by this abuse? Not how do we turn around fascists and make them less abuse prone. I don't think people who are in the crosshairs of this abuse should have to wait until we recover those fascist humanity to have a decent place to talk. It is a weird and cruel irony that the only people who get to talk to each other without Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk deciding whether it's okay are Kiwi Farms, 4chan, and 8kun, right? Wouldn't it be nice if the rest of us had that privilege? And as much as I understand that there are people who work in trust and safety in these platforms who are doing the Lord's work and really care about it, I don't think that there's anyone who is so good at that job that I would say that no one should be allowed to talk without them deciding what they said was all right. I think that foundationally we should have places where communities can set their norms, not least because there's just things that people who are members of the community, no matter how much skill they bring to it and empathy and how hard they work at it, there's just going to be things that communities understand that people elsewhere don't. I mean, this is one of the things you get in a union is if you've organized your shop, when the person who is joking with someone else is hurting their feelings, or when they're old mates and they don't mind. And you can tell, and you can also set norms. You can have a quiet word with them because they respect you and say, I know that you and your friend don't mind it when you call each other names, but there are people on the shop floor who don't know these norms and you're setting a bad example and this is going to rebound. And you can have that respectful conversation that people who know each other can have that can only take place within a community, not be imposed from above. So yes, let us do trust and safety. Let us have rules about harmful content. Let us also allow people to set their own norms and escape the platforms. I think it's all of the above.
We've only got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
I worked in fraud detection for 5 years. I've got so much to say there, but I'm gonna let it go. What I'm gonna do instead is I'm gonna wrap up a little bit here. So there's one question that's coming that I'm just tempted to go with as our final question. Just as poop over time fertilizes the ground, do you see any long-term benefits? Good things that'll be fertilized after enshittification.
Huh. Well, look, I, as I said, I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's a digital rights group, and it's been around for 35 years. I've been a part of it for 25 years. And there's a story about people who've been doing this stuff as long as I have, or as long as EFF has, that we were very naive. We thought that if we just gave everyone technology, everything would be fine, and that it didn't need anything else. But honestly, if that's what you think, you would never start a group like EFF or go to work for it, because if everything's going to be fine, why do you need to show up for work? I think that we have always, in this part of the movement that I'm part of, we have always been, on the one hand, extremely excited about the potential, but also really frightened about what happens if it went wrong. There's an IP lawyer who wrote a white paper once about 3D printing and copyright called "This Will All Be So Great If We Don't Screw It Up." And this is like how I feel about technology every day. This could be so great if we don't screw it up. And obviously we're screwing it up now, but I think it's redeemable. And I think that if we can shift people's views about why things have gone wrong from the, this is the galaxy brain meme, from the little brain, which is, oh, it's because consumers shopped wrong, right? And, we just have to shop our way out of this monopoly through very conscious consumption, to, oh no, this is the ketamine-addled Zucker-Muskian failures who run the company, and it's because they're evil that it went wrong. And they are evil, but no, it's the policy environment. We have an enshittigenic policy environment. Policymakers in living memory took specific policy decisions that they were warned of at the time would have this outcome, and it has come to pass. And if we can get people to realize that it's not about finding the moral perfection of Mark Zuckerberg, which I think is going to elude us, but instead finding policy environment, recovering a policy environment where people like Mark Zuckerberg fail instead of thriving. That is how we build a better internet, and we need it. We need a digital nervous system. As a young anti-nuclear proliferation activist, I used to ride a bicycle around the streets of Toronto in sub-zero weather with a bucket of wheat paste and a stack of flyers that I was sticking up on telephone poles. If you think we're going to organize a mass movement at home, let alone between us and our comrades in Kenya, without the internet, I want you to spend a couple of cold nights out there with a bucket of wheat paste and tell me what you think.
And on that happy note, we're going to wrap up. Got 60 seconds. Any closing remarks from either of you?
Yeah. If you are in a union, get involved more. If you're not in a union, join it and get involved.
Lovely.
I'm going to completely just stick with that.
Perfect.
I thought you were going to say I'm going to completely disagree. That'd have been very funny.
Can't add another R to the event. But I was going to say the same thing, but just kind of closing stuff here. I think we can all agree it's a good time to join a union, right? If you're not in a union, it's definitely a good time to join. And if you're already in a union, get more involved. There's 3 unions here, and there's plenty of ways you can get involved within those 3 unions, I'm sure. So the last thing I would say is that we are asking for your support to kind of drive this campaign forward. It's not just about sitting here and listening to Cory Doctorow talk about enshittification, because I think we can do that all day. But, we will actually
You've been talking to my wife.
But, we actually want to build something out of this. So if you can, there's now a link in the chat. Just click on it. You just have to click a button, essentially, and you'll be part of a list, and we'll get in touch with you to get more involved in the tech union movement. So just want to say a massive thank you to Cory for coming down here.
Thank you, folks. What an honor.
And thank you to Eleanor and to Gabrielle for their time as well. It's not often that you get to sit next to the person who writes a
Did a famous swear
and wrote a world famous book. So it is an absolute honor. And
thank you.
And on that note, thank you everybody for joining, who's been joining us. We had a lot of people join today, so that is
fabulous.
So Thank you so much.